Eleanor's hands trembled as she stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, hundreds of eyes fixed on her. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim, focusing a spotlight on her black and white waitress uniform that now felt like a costume of shame. Richard Caldwell, one of Boston's wealthiest businessmen, stood nearby with a smug smile stretching across his face. "I've been told our server here fancies herself a singer," he announced to the crowd of tuxedos and evening gowns. "Why don't you entertain us, dear? Show us what real talent sounds like." His voice dripped with mockery as laughter rippled through the audience of elite socialites. Eleanor had been serving champagne moments earlier, grateful for the extra shift at this charity gala that would help cover her grandmother's medical bills. She'd never expected to be singled out, humiliated for the whispered conversation another server had overheard and apparently reported to Mr. Caldwell. She looked toward the exit, calculating if she could simply walk away, but she needed this job. The catering company wouldn't hire her again if she caused a scene. Her throat closed with panic as Richard stepped closer. "What's wrong?" "Stage fright," he taunted, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "I thought you told everyone you once had dreams of becoming a professional singer. Surely you can manage one little song for us." Eleanor saw the faces watching her, some embarrassed, others amused, most simply waiting for the uncomfortable moment to pass so they could return to their evening. But something in her shifted. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of too many indignities endured, or perhaps it was the memory of her grandmother telling her never to hide her light. "What would you like to hear, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by satisfaction. "Something classical, perhaps? Show us what you're really capable of." He stepped back, gesturing toward the small stage where a piano stood. Eleanor walked slowly toward the piano, aware of every footstep echoing in the quiet room. The pianist, an older gentleman who had been providing background music all evening, looked at her with concern. She leaned down and whispered a request in his ear. He nodded, repositioning his hands over the keys. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes as the first notes filled the air. When Eleanor opened her mouth to sing the opening lines of "O mio babino caro," the audience collectively gasped. The crystal-clear voice that emerged seemed impossible from the small-framed waitress. Pure and powerful, it soared through the ballroom, filling every corner with its emotional depth. The area's plaintive yearning translated perfectly through her control and expressiveness. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the servers in the back of the room stood motionless. Richard Caldwell's smug smile dissolved into disbelief as Eleanor's voice climbed effortlessly to the difficult high notes, holding them with a vibrato that spoke of years of training. His attempt at public mockery was transforming before his eyes into something altogether different. As the final notes faded, the room remained in perfect silence for 3 heartbeats, then erupted into thunderous applause. Before that night at the Westfield Charity Gala, Eleanor Green's life had been a carefully balanced struggle between dreams deferred and harsh reality. Growing up in a small apartment above her grandparents' bookstore in Dorchester, music had been her salvation from an early age. Her grandmother, Vivian, a former church choir director, recognized the exceptional quality in Eleanor's voice when she was just 6 years old, singing along to the radio while dusting bookshelves. "You have a gift, sweetheart," Vivian would tell her. A true, God-given gift. By 16, Eleanor was winning local competitions and had earned a scholarship to a prestigious summer vocal program. Her talent had caught the attention of several notable instructors, one of whom had connections to Berklee College of Music. The path seemed clear. Eleanor would be the one to break the cycle of financial struggle that had defined her family for generations. Then came the stroke that left her grandfather partially paralyzed, followed by the mounting medical bills and the struggle to keep the bookstore open. Eleanor's college fund was the first to go. By the time she graduated high school, her grandmother was also showing signs of heart disease. Without hesitation, Eleanor postponed her education and took on multiple jobs to help support the only family she had ever known. The years that followed were a blur of double shifts, community college night classes in business management, and the slow, painful process of watching her grandparents' health decline despite her best efforts. Singing became a luxury she couldn't afford, both in terms of time for practice and the expensive lessons required to maintain her technique. By 30, Eleanor had become versed in the art of invisibility that service industry workers perfect. She could blend into the background at the upscale restaurants where she worked, anticipating needs without being noticed, smiling through rudeness, and counting tips at the end of shifts that never quite stretched far enough. Her grandfather had passed 3 years ago, and now her grandmother needed specialized care that their insurance barely covered. Eleanor had taken the catering job for the extra income, picking up as many events as possible, particularly those with wealthy patrons known for generous tips. On the other side of Boston, Richard Caldwell had built his reputation as a cutthroat real estate developer with political aspirations. At 52, his personal fortune was estimated at over $300 million, most of it made by buying distressed properties in working-class neighborhoods and redeveloping them into luxury condominiums. The displacement of longtime residents was, in his view, simply the cost of progress. Richard's charity galas were legendary, not for their generosity but for their extravagance. The Westfield event was ostensibly raising money for arts education in public schools, though most attendees knew it was primarily an opportunity for networking and being seen in the right social circles. What few knew about Richard was his almost pathological need to assert dominance in every situation. Those who worked for him feared his habit of public humiliation as a management tactic. Waitstaff at his events were often subjected to his particular brand of condescension, which he found amusing and which no one in his circle ever challenged. When one of the catering company supervisors had mentioned a waitress who once had operatic ambitions, Richard saw an opportunity for entertainment. The supervisor, hoping to curry favor, had pointed Eleanor out early in the evening. Richard had observed her throughout the cocktail hour, noting her quiet efficiency, the way she kept her eyes downcast when serving his more important guests, the slight limp from what he assumed were hours on her feet. "Tell me," he'd asked a colleague while watching Eleanor clear glasses, "do you think people end up in service jobs because they've failed at everything else, or because they lack the ambition to try anything better?" His colleague had laughed uncomfortably. "Perhaps they just haven't had the advantages we've had, Richard." Richard had dismissed this with a wave. "Advantages are created, not given. I started with nothing." This, of course, was far from true. Richard's nothing had included an Ivy League education paid for by his parents and a substantial trust fund that had financed his first real estate ventures. But the myth of his self-made status was one he had repeated so often he now believed it himself. As the evening progressed, Richard's plan to use Eleanor as the evening's entertainment took shape in his mind. It would be amusing to see her embarrassment, a little lesson in reality for someone who had delusions of talent. The fact that it might make his wealthy friends laugh was bonus enough. What Richard couldn't have known was that Eleanor still practiced singing daily, in the early mornings before work, in the shower, and most importantly, at her grandmother's bedside in the nursing home, where her voice brought comfort and triggered memories of happier times. She hadn't performed publicly in years, but music remained the thread that kept her connected to her own humanity. As the gala dinner concluded and the auction portion of the evening was about to begin, Richard noticed Eleanor refilling water glasses near his table. The perfect moment had arrived. The Westfield Gala transformed the historic Hamilton Hall into a glittering showcase of wealth and privilege. Crystal stemware caught the light from antique chandeliers, casting prismatic reflections across tables adorned with arrangements of white orchids and blue hydrangeas. The guest list read like a who's who of Boston society: old money families, tech entrepreneurs, politicians, and celebrities, all dressed in their finest and adorned with jewelry that cost more than what Eleanor earned in a year. For the catering staff, the evening had begun hours earlier with strict instructions from the event coordinator: be invisible unless needed. No conversation with guests unless addressed directly. And absolutely no mistakes. The penalty for errors wasn't stated explicitly, but everyone understood their jobs depended on flawless service. Eleanor had been assigned to the central tables, the most important guests, including Richard Caldwell himself. She'd noticed his appraising glances throughout the evening but thought nothing of it, accustomed to being sized up by wealthy patrons. She focused instead on the mechanical rhythm of service: approach from the left, serve from the right, anticipate needs before they're voiced. Between courses, she'd caught snippets of conversation that painted a clearer picture of her surroundings. A woman in a red gown describing her third home in the Maldives. A silver-haired man complaining about property taxes on his yacht. A younger couple debating whether to donate $10,000 or $15,000 to the charity, deciding on the lower amount because they probably waste half of it anyway. Eleanor had felt the familiar disconnect, the sense of moving through a parallel universe that occasionally intersected with her own but operated by entirely different rules. These were people who never checked their bank accounts before making purchases, who had never calculated whether they could afford both electricity and groceries in the same week. At table 3, a portly man had snapped his fingers at her without looking up. More wine, he demanded, not bothering with please or thank you. At table 7, a woman had complained that her fish was slightly overdone and insisted it be taken back, though the kitchen had already begun serving the next course. Throughout it all, Eleanor had maintained her professional demeanor, the pleasant half-smile that revealed nothing, the deferential nod that acknowledged without engaging. Years in the service industry had taught her the art of emotional compartmentalization. By the time dessert was being served, a delicate lemon soufflé with raspberry coulis, Eleanor's feet were throbbing in her sensible black shoes. She'd been on shift for nearly 7 hours already, with at least 3 more to go. The catering manager had pulled her aside during a brief break to tell her they were short-staffed, and she'd need to stay for cleanup. Double overtime, he'd promised, knowing she wouldn't refuse. Meanwhile, Richard Caldwell had been holding court at his table, a vintage Bordeaux loosening his tongue as he regaled his guests with stories of his latest business triumphs. At 62, he still cut an imposing figure, tall, with a full head of silver hair and the confident posture of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. The trick is knowing when to be ruthless, he was saying to the rapt attention of his tablemates. These neighborhood preservation committees, they want to keep things exactly as they are: rundown buildings, failing businesses. I come in with a vision for the future, and suddenly I'm the villain. He took another sip of wine. But 20 years from now, when those areas are thriving, no one remembers who had to be pushed aside to make it happen. A woman to his right nodded appreciatively. It takes courage to make those hard decisions, Richard. Not courage, he corrected. Clarity. Most people let sentiment cloud their judgment. He gestured expansively with his glass. Take this charity, for instance. Everyone here tonight is feeling good about themselves for donating to arts education. But how many of these kids will actually become artists? 1 in 1,000? The rest are being sold a fantasy. It was at this moment that Richard's gaze fell on Eleanor as she cleared a plate from the adjacent seat. Something clicked in his mind, a connection between his point and the information he'd gleaned earlier. Excuse me, he called out, his voice carrying more than necessary. You there, waitress? Eleanor looked up, momentarily startled at being directly addressed. Yes, sir? Come here a moment, would you? The conversation at nearby tables quieted as Eleanor approached Richard's chair. She was acutely aware of the attention shifting toward them, a spotlight of curiosity forming. My colleague here tells me you had ambitions of becoming a singer once upon a time. Opera, was it? Eleanor felt heat rise to her face. She'd mentioned her background only once, to another server during setup, not realizing anyone was listening. Her private life being made public entertainment sent a jolt of anxiety through her. I studied voice when I was younger, yes, she answered carefully. Richard smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. You see, ladies and gentlemen, he addressed the growing audience, this is exactly what I was talking about. Dreams versus reality. He stood up, placing his napkin on the table. We're raising money tonight for arts education, but perhaps we should consider the cautionary tales as well. He gestured toward Eleanor. Here we have someone who pursued music, and yet. His pointed glance at her uniform completed the thought more cruelly than words could have. Around the room, the auction preparations halted as attention focused on the unfolding scene. The event coordinator stood frozen near the stage, uncertain whether to intervene. The other servers pressed themselves against walls, grateful not to be in Eleanor's position but wincing in sympathetic embarrassment. Richard Caldwell was now fully committed to his impromptu object lesson. With the practiced timing of someone accustomed to commanding rooms, he turned to address the gathered crowd more formally. Before we move to the auction portion of our evening, I think we have an opportunity for a unique form of entertainment. His voice carried the authoritative tone of someone who expected and received compliance. Our server here apparently once had operatic aspirations. I suggest we give her the chance to show us what might have been. The room's reaction was mixed, uncomfortable shifting in seats, a few nervous laughs, some confused glances. But no one challenged Richard directly. His position, his wealth, his connections, all created a buffer of deference that no one seemed willing to breach. For Eleanor, time seemed to slow. She saw her options with painful clarity: walk out and lose her job, refuse and be further humiliated, or comply and risk making a fool of herself. Years of suppressed anger at the casual cruelty of the privileged collided with the practical reality of her grandmother's medical bills and her rent due in 3 days. Then, from somewhere deep within her, came a third option, one that Richard Caldwell, in his arrogance, had never considered. The pianist's fingers hesitated over the keys for just a moment when Eleanor whispered her song choice. His eyebrows raised slightly, but he nodded with newfound respect. The aria from Puccini's Johnny Schicchi was challenging enough to showcase a trained voice, but also emotional enough to connect with an audience unfamiliar with opera. As the opening notes filled the ballroom, Eleanor closed her eyes, transporting herself away from the judgment and cruelty of the moment. In her mind, she was singing for her grandmother in the small living room above the bookstore, the afternoon light filtering through dusty windows as they practiced together. She was singing for her younger self, the girl with dreams too big for her circumstances but too precious to abandon completely. The first phrase emerged from her lips with a purity that silenced every whisper in the room. Years of training had not been erased by time. If anything, the technical foundation her teachers had built was now enriched by the emotional depth that comes only from living through hardship. Richard Caldwell's expression shifted from smug anticipation to shock, then disbelief, as Eleanor's voice soared effortlessly through the difficult passages. The Italian lyrics spoke of a young woman pleading with her father, and though most guests didn't understand the words, the emotion transcended language barriers. There was yearning in her tone, a dignified desperation that resonated with something universal. At table 8, an elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Near the bar, a group of younger guests stood transfixed, cocktails forgotten in their hands. Even the other servers had stopped mid-task, trays balanced precariously as they turned to watch their colleague transform before their eyes. Halfway through the piece, a distinguished man in the back of the room leaned forward in his seat, his attention completely captured. David Levinson, head of the Boston Symphony Orchestra's community outreach program and a guest at the gala, had arrived late and missed the build-up to this moment. All he knew was that he was hearing a voice of exceptional quality in the most unexpected setting. Eleanor reached the aria's climax, her voice climbing to the high B with flawless control, holding the note with a vibrato that spoke of both technical mastery and raw emotion. The sound filled every corner of the grand space, making the crystal chandeliers seem to vibrate in sympathetic resonance. Richard Caldwell sank slowly back into his chair, the color draining from his face as he realized his attempt at public humiliation had backfired spectacularly. Around him, people who had been laughing at his joke minutes earlier were now entranced, some with tears in their eyes. His momentary power play had transformed into something he could no longer control. As Eleanor approached the final phrases of the aria, she opened her eyes, allowing herself to fully inhabit the present moment. She saw the stunned faces, the parted lips, the complete attention of everyone in the room. For the first time in years, she was not invisible. For these brief minutes, she existed fully as herself, not as a servant, not as a caregiver, not as a person struggling to stay afloat, but as an artist. The final notes hung in the air like a question, then faded into a silence so complete it seemed everyone in the room was holding their breath. For 3 long seconds, no one moved. Then, from the back of the room, David Levinson rose to his feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Like a wave, others followed, first one table, then another, until the entire ballroom was filled with thunderous approval. People stood, whistled, called out brava, as if they were at the opera house rather than a charity gala. Eleanor remained still, momentarily overwhelmed by the response. She had not performed publicly in so long that she had almost forgotten this feeling, the electric connection between performer and audience, the exchange of vulnerability for appreciation. From her position near the stage, the event coordinator made a split-second decision and approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "Eleanor Green." What an unexpected treasure. The applause intensified. Richard Caldwell, realizing the need to save face, slowly joined the standing ovation, his expression unreadable. At a table near the front, a woman in a midnight blue gown turned to her companion. "Did you know about this? Was this planned?" The man shook his head. "I don't think so. Look at Caldwell's face." In another corner, phones had emerged to capture the moment, the glow of screens punctuating the darkened room. Within minutes, clips would begin circulating on social media with captions like "Waitress with the voice of an angel," and "You won't believe what happened at the Westfield Gala." As the applause finally began to subside, David Levinson made his way through the crowd toward Eleanor. His path was blocked momentarily by others rushing to offer their own congratulations. "That was extraordinary. Where did you study? Do you perform regularly? Here's my card, we should talk." Eleanor answered politely but briefly, aware that she was still on the clock, still responsible for her duties. The surreal quality of the moment, being celebrated 1 minute and expected to clear plates the next, was not lost on her. When David finally reached her, he introduced himself quietly, away from the clamor of the crowd. "Ms. Green, I'm David Levinson with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. I would very much like to speak with you when you have a moment." Eleanor nodded, stunned to be addressed by someone whose name she recognized from concert programs. "I'll be finished around midnight," she managed to say. "I'll wait," he replied simply. As the event coordinator attempted to regain control of the room and direct attention toward the planned auction, Eleanor slipped back into server mode, moving toward the kitchen with empty champagne flutes. But something had fundamentally shifted. She walked differently now, shoulders back, head high, with the posture of someone who had reclaimed a part of herself long thought lost. In the kitchen, the other servers greeted her with a mixture of awe and newfound respect. "That was incredible. Why didn't you tell us you could sing like that? Did you see Caldwell's face? Priceless." Even the catering manager, typically stern and unimpressed, nodded with approval. "Take 15 minutes, he said, which in catering language was the equivalent of a standing ovation. As Eleanor stepped outside for a brief moment of fresh air, the cool night breeze against her face, she allowed herself to acknowledge a feeling she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just the vague wish for things to improve someday, but a concrete sense that a door had opened, that possibilities existed beyond the carefully contained life she had built around survival. 6 months after the Westfield Gala, Eleanor sat in a small dressing room at Symphony Hall, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed both familiar and strange, dressed in an elegant black gown rather than a server's uniform, hairstyled professionally, a quiet confidence in her eyes that had been absent for years. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. 10 minutes, Ms. Green," called the stage manager. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, taking a deep breath to center herself. The journey from that fateful night to this moment had been nothing short of extraordinary. David Levinson had kept his promise to wait for her after the gala, and their conversation in a quiet corner of the emptying venue had stretched until nearly 2 in the morning. He had listened to her story with genuine interest, her early training, the family circumstances that had derailed her plans, the years of working multiple jobs while keeping her voice alive only in private. "Talent like yours doesn't disappear," he had told her. "It just waits for the right moment." That night, he had offered her an audition for the community concert series sponsored by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, paid performances designed to bring classical music to broader audiences. 2 weeks later, still in shock at this turn of events, Eleanor had sung for a small panel of music directors who had immediately offered her a contract for 3 concerts. What followed was a whirlwind of preparation alongside her regular work. Eleanor had initially kept her waitressing job, uncertain whether this opportunity would lead anywhere sustainable. But when a local news station picked up the story of the singing waitress of Boston, complete with smartphone footage from the gala that had gone viral, additional offers began to arrive. A wealthy patron of the arts offered to sponsor voice lessons with a renowned coach. A community college invited her to teach a weekend workshop on vocal technique. A local opera company asked her to audition for their upcoming season. Gradually, Eleanor had been able to reduce her restaurant hours, creating space for music to reclaim its central place in her life. The most unexpected development had come 6 weeks after the gala, when Eleanor received a letter from Richard Caldwell's office requesting a meeting. Her initial instinct had been to refuse, the humiliation of that night still fresh despite its ultimately positive outcome. But curiosity had won out, and she had agreed to meet him at his downtown office. Richard had seemed diminished somehow in the more mundane setting of a conference room, without an audience to perform for. He had offered her a seat with uncharacteristic politeness. "Ms. Green," he had begun, "I owe you an apology." The words had clearly been difficult for him to speak. A man accustomed to bending circumstances to his will rather than acknowledging mistakes, Richard had struggled visibly with this conversation. "My behavior at the gala was inexcusable," he had continued. "I used my position to put you in an uncomfortable situation for my own amusement, and that was wrong." Eleanor had remained silent, allowing him the discomfort of filling the space between them. "I've been doing some reflection since then," he had admitted. "About power, about assumptions, about the kind of person I've become." He had looked up at her directly. "Your dignity that night, and your extraordinary talent, made quite an impression on many people. Including me." The apology had seemed genuine, though Eleanor had wondered if it would have come at all had her performance been less remarkable. Still, she had accepted it with grace, having learned long ago that bitterness served no useful purpose. What had surprised her most was his next statement. "I've established a scholarship fund," Richard had explained, "for working musicians who had to interrupt their education due to financial hardship. I'd like you to be on the selection committee, if you're willing." Eleanor had agreed, recognizing the opportunity to help others facing the same obstacles she had encountered. The first 3 scholarships had been awarded the previous month to promising young musicians from low-income backgrounds, a small but meaningful step toward changing the systems that had nearly silenced her own voice. Now, preparing for her debut as a featured soloist with the Boston Pop Spring program, Eleanor thought about the strange, meandering path that had led her here. She thought about her grandmother, now receiving improved care in a better facility thanks to Eleanor's increased income. She thought about the many messages she had received from service industry workers inspired by her story to pursue their own deferred dreams. A second knock came at the dressing room door. "Ms. Green? There's someone here to see you before you go on." Eleanor opened the door to find her grandmother in a wheelchair, accompanied by a nurse and beaming with pride. "Grandma!" Eleanor exclaimed, kneeling to embrace the woman who had first recognized her gift. "I thought you weren't feeling well enough to come tonight." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Vivian replied, her voice weakened by age but her eyes bright with joy. "I told you years ago that God doesn't give gifts like yours without expecting them to be shared." Eleanor felt tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "I would have found my way back to music eventually," she said. "But I never imagined it would happen like this." Vivian patted her hand. "Life rarely follows the path we imagine for it. The detours are where we learn who we truly are." The stage manager appeared again. "It's time, Ms. Green." Eleanor kissed her grandmother's cheek and stood, smoothing her gown. "Wish me luck?" "You don't need luck," Vivian replied. "Just remember why you sing." Moments later, as Eleanor walked onto the Symphony Hall stage to enthusiastic applause, she thought about her grandmother's words. She sang not just for herself, or for her family, or even for the audience filling the historic venue. She sang because the world needs beauty in unexpected places, needs reminders that talent and dignity exist everywhere, in grand concert halls and in neighborhood diners, in expensive private schools and in struggling community centers. As the orchestra began the introduction to her first piece, Eleanor caught sight of Richard Caldwell in the third row, seated quietly among the patrons. Their eyes met briefly, acknowledgement passing between them of how a moment intended as cruelty had transformed into something neither could have predicted. Eleanor took a deep breath and began to sing. The same voice that had stunned the gala audience now filled Symphony Hall with its warmth and clarity. In the perfect acoustics of the space designed for music, her years of practice, her natural gift, and the emotional depth forged through struggle combined to create something transcendent. In that moment, Eleanor understood that sometimes life's most painful detours lead to destinations more meaningful than we could have charted for ourselves. The path matters as much as the arrival. Her years of invisible service, of putting dreams on hold, of enduring small indignities with grace, none of it had been wasted. It had all become part of her voice, adding textures and shadows that made her artistry uniquely powerful. As the final notes of her performance faded into appreciative silence, followed by thunderous applause, Eleanor stood in the warm glow of the spotlight, fully present in her reclaimed identity. The journey had been neither straight nor easy, but standing here now, heard, seen, valued for her true gifts, she wouldn't have changed a single step. Sometimes, she reflected as she took her bow, our greatest moments come not when dreams unfold exactly as planned, but when we find the courage to share our authentic voices, especially after someone has tried to silence them. In that courage lies not just personal triumph, but the power to inspire others to recognize their own worth, to refuse to be defined by circumstances or by others' perceptions, and to keep faith with the gifts they carry, however long the waiting.